Welcome to the second part of my discussion with Professor Frank Schulze-Engler about Tara June Winch's The Yield. In this part, we discuss ways of coming to terms with histories of violence and atrocity, as well as the meaning and relevance of terms such as world literature and transcultural literature. If you haven't yet listened to the first part, I suggest you check that out first. And if you're enjoying our conversation, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Welcome to the second part of our discussion on The Yield by Tara June Winch. With me is Professor Frank Schulze-Engler. If you haven't watched the first part, please do check that out first. We had a very good, I think, overview of the book and some of the key issues. Now, we talked a lot in the first part about the different types of violence we see in the novel, and going to continue in that vein. Because as you mentioned in your summary at the beginning, there are, several layers of the narrative, and one part of the narrative are the letters of Reverend Greenleaf, and in them we get a pretty unsparing account of atrocities committed against the Aboriginal population by the colonizers. That history is there, and you referred to it in part one as not a blaming novel. Now, how do you think the novel proposes that the population of a country like Australia, which of course includes clearly descendants of both colonizers and Aboriginals and, people of mixture of these stocks, how can a novel like this, does it propose a way of coming to terms with a history of violence and oppression such as the one that's described?
Yes. Let me just add one thing. When you gave that little list of people, right, white and black and mixed, they're also migrants. There are now millions of people who are neither white nor black, but from Africa, Asia, all parts of the world who have come to Australia, many of them from Asia. And of course, who are also now Australians of a new type, right? But of course, the question was reconciliation, producing maybe something new out of that. And I think the book makes very clear that it is not just a question of saying sorry. Although that saying sorry maybe was a first important symbolic step. But clearly this is, if at all, the beginning and not the end of something. And I think what we can see in the novel also is on part of the Aboriginal people, it is a question of overcoming victimhood. There are clear passages where August herself has to learn not to see herself as a victim, because that is crippling. It totally circumscribes her. It does not allow her to act as freely as she needs to and wants to. So victimhood, seeing yourself primarily as the victim of things that were done to you or to your ancestors, this is something that Aboriginal people will have to overcome. I think that is a very clear message in the book. At the same time, this does not imply that you could possibly wish to or should forget this violence. And this is, of course, now where the white population comes in, or the non-Aboriginal population comes in, because this is, of course, a question of acknowledging what is, after all, a joint history. Through these crimes committed in colonialism, of course, white and black Australians share a history. This is one of the reasons why there is no return to some pristine type of traditional Aboriginality. That's impossible. That has been destroyed by history. So what has to happen is something else. And I think this is what the book is all about, right? But an important part on the part of the white population is to acknowledge what has happened, first of all, to draw consequences for the present, for example, with how to deal with the livelihoods of Aboriginal people in contemporary Australia. It's not just history. I mean, people are no longer killed and, today, but the tin mine tries to literally erase, right, the land, the country in which they live, right? So this is also a lesson to be learned, right? Obviously, respect. This is in Albert's dictionary, right? And it
Mm,
has a long end, right? So respect, yes. And of course, on both sides, not all white characters are somehow part of an oppressive culture. And not all indigenous people are part of a resistant and good culture. Yeah, right.
mm,
So that's also important, right? To meet at a human level without prejudices that have been, yeah, bred in people for generations. But of course, at the heart of this is this violent colonial relationship. So this is something that will have to be addressed.
mm,
And again, for the Aboriginal people, I think this is very clearly so. It is recuperating what they can of their language and culture, not in order to live in the past, but in order to make sense of the present and the future. And this is something the book suggests that
mm.
is gift, to themselves, but also to Australia as a whole, right?
Yeah.
So it is not actually a novel that is set on conflict. It acknowledges past and present conflicts, but it is not one that is predicated on the fact that, these two, the twain will never meet. No, no, they have met already in very powerful and often tragic ways.
Mm,
But yes, they have to learn to live with each other, right? And Aboriginal people can do what they can to this. But of course, this is something that has to be addressed by all Australians.
mm. And it's, what you're saying about that past, it takes me back to again something you said in part one, which is about the structure of the novel, and in particular these letters. I mean, firstly, I think it seems to be quite common in what we could call transcultural fiction, and we'll talk about that term in just a moment, that you have narratives that move a shifting between, well, spatial locations very often, but also between time frames. And of course, it's a great advantage of fiction. One of the sort of demands of historical fiction or fiction that addresses history is like, why not just tell it how it was, right? And I think we see one of the advantages of fiction, it has that flexibility. You can sort of bring together those two time frames. So,
Yeah,
the effects of the past come right up against the
right.
narrative in the present, and we start to see those relations. So I think that's something
Yeah.
else it's doing as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in literary studies, we use the term multi-perspectival narration, right?
Mm,
Saying more than one perspective. The Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie, right? She has put it wonderfully in a podcast that she called "The Danger of a Single Story,"
mm,
and I think this is also an excellent example to tell the complexity of relations between humans Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal, and the landscape, nature, animals, plants, the land, right? It's such a complex story that you do need different perspectives to somehow piece together what it is all about.
mm,
And so, in that sense, yes, these shifting timeframes are very important. And also the fact that although this Reverend Greenleaf, in the end, I mean, he doesn't get a very good press, right? Because
yeah.
through his own letters, he shows himself to be, yes, of course, he feels with the poor Aboriginal people, right? But he stays in that frame of pity on the one hand, of saying, well, this is impossible, how these white settlers behave. On the other, yes, he has some honest, strong criticism there. But in the end, it is a sort of humanitarian thing that doesn't go anywhere. And when
Mm,
violence is being committed, he cannot really help them and resist, right? So he's part of a
mm,
holistic mind frame, right? That the novel also wants to break through. And yet, in his letters are things that will help later generations to regain the land, right?
mm.
So letters are an important part of the puzzle. They also contribute something to the land claim that in the end is victorious, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, also on another level, those letters help later generations who are reading that novel, because on one level, hopefully nowadays, people know in a general sense that there were colonial atrocities, but then, you maybe haven't studied
No.
Aboriginal populations in Australia in detail. You read this stuff, it's like, woof, you get the stark detail of it. So it has that, effect
Yes.
in itself of, bringing that history to the present as well.
Right. And showing it as a systematic feature. I mean, these are
Mm,
not digital wrongdoings, although, of course, yes, there are killings that are individual wrongdoings, right?
Mm.
But the fact, for example, that Aboriginal populations were uprooted, resettled, put in a certain place, like the place where we are here on Massacre Plains, resettled in order to act as basically servants, agricultural workers,
Mm.
right, for white people. That is a systematic injustice, we can say, that is apart from individual guilt, which of course also is there, right? I mean, not all white settlers were murderers, but some were. And that is also part of the story.
Yeah. Let's broaden the discussion out a little bit. You mentioned the term transcultural fiction. A lot of your academic work has been on transcultural writing. You just published a book, co-edited with Pavan Kumar Malreddy, which is called Mapping World Anglophone Studies, English in a World of Strangers. So we got a couple of terms there. Yeah, world Anglophone studies. We have this term world literature that's still used sometimes. What what do you think are the differences between, let's take those two, transcultural literature, the maybe older idea of world literature, the place of Anglophone writing within these, and of course, feel free to bring in, other related subjects. We're going into the realm of course, post-colonial writing, and there are other terms that are kind of around in these discussions as well.
Yeah, sure. Right. There are a few terms to unpack here.
Mm,
And as you suggested, we could start with world literature and how it relates to transculturality. And of course, world literature has seen a very, very interesting history, right? If we take, as many critics do, if we take Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, right, as the one who coined the term,
mm,
um, then it is very interesting that he was thinking of an era, because later on, world literature turned into a quality. For
mm,
many people in literary studies, right, world literature, to say this belongs to world literature, man, this book has a certain quality that makes it world literature. Goethe's thinking was not like that. He said the era of world literature has emerged because through commerce and relations, all literatures of the world are somehow related. He did not think of Aboriginal Australian literature. He did not think of African literature, for
mm,
example, but he did think of Asian literature, Persian literature. And so, I mean, he did go far beyond Europe, but not, of course, as far as we might wish or need to go today. So this is the term world literature has had a renaissance, I think, in the last 2, 3 decades that have gone directly in this have followed this strand of looking at relationality and broadening the term. Because world literary study, comparative literature for a long time used to be more or less Eurocentric, right? It was the great literatures of Europe, basically, where comparatives would do their work, right? And they used the term world literature quite a lot, right? But now the discussion has broadened immensely, right? And world literature debates are now there in Asia, in Africa, indeed, with regard to indigenous literatures as well. So the term is being used in a variety of very new contexts, right? And so world literature indeed has traveled, it has changed. And of course, there are a number of very different theoretical formulations, which I don't want to go into here. But just to say what interests me is this relationality. And in that sense, I would indeed return to Goethe and say what fascinated him is also what should fascinate us, right? This relationality, so that in some sense, all works of literature produced in the contemporary world are somehow world literature.
mm,
Although we can argue that some of them are more into this by way of, for example, being multi-sited, explicitly dealing with cultural contact, and I don't know what, right? But even those that do not have some sort of attachment, and I would use Edward Said's, the famous literary critic and theorist term, worldliness, right? Which is somehow the fact that literature is attached to the world, not in documenting it or in reflecting it, as some previous Marxist theories like to have it. No, but in being in relation to the world, just as the readers of these texts are as well. And that, of course, produces a worldliness then of world literature. I think that is what, to me, current debates are about. And in that sense, transculturality, I think, is a facet maybe of world literature. So it helps to overcome notions of what you could call cultural containers,
Mm.
right? The idea that national boundaries and cultural boundaries and linguistic and literary boundaries all fall into each other, right? So that when we talk about national literatures, as we often do, German, Italian, whatever, Australian literature, we have the sort of container image of what is in these literatures. And transculturality tells us that these cultural differences are, first of all, always constructed. And whatever may be there in terms of real life attachments, and there are many, the world does not come to us readily packed in these cultural containers. This is very much a 19th century worldview,
Mm.
produced by 19th century European nationalism, taken over by burgeoning nationalisms in other parts of the world that found this way of thinking useful. In Africa, for example, right? This idea of national literature, yeah, we have our own national literature, yeah, as opposed to the ravages of colonialism, which is understandable and to some extent also very logical, but in the end hits against the boundaries that, whether in Africa or anywhere else, literature do not respect borders that way.
Mm.
People, cultures do not respect these borders, right? They are border crossing, literally, metaphorically, but also literally in so many ways. And transculturality helps to understand these dynamics. And one of the main sentences I always like to formulate here is, if, before the idea was what do cultures do with people, in the sense of, if you're part of this culture, how does it shape your individual being? I would say the transcultural question would be, what do people, not peoples, but people, what do people do with culture?
Mm.
So culture matters by all means. It's not a question of deconstructing it out of the way and say it's all an illusion. No, it matters. But it is not an unforgoable fact that
Mm.
shapes lives, but it is, lives are in dialogue with cultures, or what people understand to be cultures.
Mm.
And maybe I could say something also about this term, Anglophone studies, world Anglophone
Sure.
literature. And you were kind enough to mention our book and the subtitle, English in a World of Strangers. And if I can start with that, the idea here is, of course, that through colonial history, obviously English spread throughout the world in the wake of colonialism and imperialism. That's a historical fact. But in the process, of course, things happened to English. It became localized. It also became the language, including the mother tongue of many people throughout the world. And we are used to thinking of mother tongue English speakers only as implicitly sort of white Western people, like Brits, people in the USA, Canadians, Australians, whatever. But in fact, in many other parts of the world, there are now native speakers, right, of English, and there are people for whom English is one of their mother tongues. Many people in the world are bilingual or trilingual or multilingual, and English often, in those parts where English is spoken, is part of that mix. Yeah. So the idea of English in the world of strangers is to say there is no longer an Anglophone world where through speaking English you can assume that you're part of that world.
Mm.
No, English is now part of a wider world, including a world in which so many other languages exist, in which it has to find its place. Past colonial glory is over. Decolonization is over in that sense. And what we have now is new arrangements also among languages, where people, for example, define their identities, their cultural linguistic identities, through, again, being in relation. And so many of the texts I think of what I would call, transcultural texts, they also deal with this linguistic transculturality. And The Yield is a wonderful example of that,
Mm.
right? It is an Anglophone novel. And, a year ago, I heard a talk on The Yield at a conference where somebody was talking about the Wiradjuri text. And I challenged the speaker later and said, but look, this is an English book. written in English. And she said, yes, sure, but underneath it is the Wiradjuri text and the culture. And I said, but this is an essentialist way of looking at this that is not going to help anyone to understand the text. We have first of all to acknowledge that English is the language of the text, that English is, to some extent, also an indigenous language. Take that away, the Aboriginal people in this book can't speak. So English, yes, is an indigenous language. It is not the same indigenous language as Wiradjuri is. And of course, there's a long, complicated history and conflictual history here among languages. But the important thing is that for example, the characters in this book, it's not an either or question.
Mm.
Their life unfolds in the contact zone between Wiradjuri and English. And in real life, we can put in many other languages. As we said, Australia is an immigrant country. There are millions of people living there who are neither the descendants of white settlers nor the descendants of indigenous people, right? And all of them also claim Australia as their own, including bringing their own linguistic heritages. So, and I think this is what transcultural theory is particularly interested in and attuned to looking at these relations, right? These complications of simple ideas of my culture and your culture, or our culture and their culture, right? Because if you look closely enough, what you often find is that these things are more or less illusory and much more complex.
So it seems there's a sort of implicit criticism in what you're saying towards maybe some approaches towards literature, indeed towards theorizing culture. Do you think in general, let's say the way literature is studied now, whether it be whether we put a label on like transcultural or world literature, do you think it's sort of in a healthy place? Do you think people are maybe I remember one of my professors, undergraduate, master's, sort of saying, often fiction is ahead of the theorizing. Do you think that's the case? Are we
Yes.
catching up with what literature is now doing? Have we caught up? Are we a lot of people barking up the wrong tree? How do you see the state of the field?
There's a short answer, which is yes, and a long answer is also yes, but no, absolutely so. I mean, this is what I find so fascinating about my own field of studies, which is World Anglophone Studies, right? Is how we are privileged actually to be in contact, close contact with literatures who are actually doing all of this amazing work, where often critical practices are still lagging behind. And before I talk about post-colonial and decolonial theory for just a moment, I would like to mention another approach that is very, very common. And just a few days ago on the radio, driving home from shopping, I heard an interview with a cultural specialist in Germany, right, who was a multicultural person, and speaks many languages. And she was so happy about all of this diversity, but she presented it really as if she was talking about other peoples, now with an S, right, and their cultures. So there was zero space there for individuality, for indeed transculturality, for the complex mixtures that come up. It was all about how wonderful it is to know about Turkish people and their culture, and about Moroccan people and their culture. And yes, of course, I fully support all of this, and it's mind-opening and so on. But on the other hand, if we really try to think that all Turks and all Moroccans and all Germans, right, sort of share one culture that they can exchange, and so on, I think that is closing some doors again, because it's an illusionary image of where we are, right? And I think it's very, very widespread. It's a sort of, shall we say, white Western liberal, if I was to take up these terms, right? Well-meant position, which does some good, but also, I think, has some fairly serious negative effects. Now, if I may, I'll just say something very briefly about postcolonial studies and
Please do,
decolonial
yeah.
theory. Because with regard to particularly indigenous literatures, but also literatures from the global south or the formerly colonized world or the post-colonial world, right, as some theorists have it, there is this idea, yes, in post-colonial, obviously, that one can define some literatures of the world in terms of their post-coloniality, in fact, having come after colonialism or still being in relation to colonialism and so on. And again, if we take the yield, yes, I mean, there is a true element in that story, obviously, because the yield is full of these references to colonialism, right? But at the same time, it is so very, very clear that the characters in that book have to break out of that frame. And when August and other characters reflect on the necessity not to be victims anymore, that is, not to see themselves as being defined through their victimhood, and not to be defined through their shame, right? Then I think it becomes very clear that there is also a strong emphasis here on overcoming colonialism and these colonial relations. Not in the sense of overcoming, forgiving, and forgetting, yeah, colonialism. No, not at all. This is not at all what this and so many books are about, but of not remaining caught, right, in relations as the mainly defining feature. And so much of the literature that comes out of, Asia and the Caribbean and Africa today is sometimes not at all about this colonial relation, right? It is about new conflicts, new problems, constellations that have come up after independence. So the term post-colonialism in this sense is, of course, misleading, right? Because it suggests that there's a primacy here. And for some works, historically, that may undoubtedly be so. And even for some contemporary works, this may be so. But the idea that one can define whole literatures as post-colonial literatures, right? I think that's highly misleading. And for me, The Yield is not a post-colonial novel, right? In terms of this agenda of some parts of post-colonial theory. And, the sort of writing back idea, for example. Yeah. I don't think The Yield is writing back at all. It is writing, or if it is writing back, it's also writing back to Aboriginal people, not just Western white readers, and it's writing forward to laying the groundwork for a new Australia, which simply be laid by saying forgive and forget and sorry, and that's it. No, no, no. It's a long drawn process. But maybe this is a small stepping stone, right? Involving, as we said before, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people at the same time. And of course, with decolonial theory, the problem is even more compounded because there the idea is that you can somehow forget and uneducate Western modernity and return to something that was there before. And this to me seems totally illusory. And very often it ends up in romanticizing indigenous cultures without actually being interested in what indigenous writers are doing today. Most people have been brainwashed through processes of Western modernity, that maybe so or not, but it implies, that the voices that we hear or can read, like our novel here, The Yield, that this is also, in a wider perspective, part of a brainwash. So unfortunate. I mean, the real thing is yet to come. And I think that's a sort of quasi-religious language that I think criticism can do without. So decolonization obviously is something that is on the map and needs to stay there for generations to come, probably. But decolonial theory is not something that we really need to sort of achieve this.
And just to come back to The Yield then to finish with, putting a label on things can be of limited use, but it can be a useful way of also thinking through them. So you argued it's not a post-colonial novel. Would you say it's typical of contemporary transcultural fiction, Anglophone fiction? Maybe that's a meaningless question because that's such a big field and so varied that, we can't really answer it. Is it, maybe we could phrase it, is it doing something different from most other novels? Is it doing something quite unique? Is there sort of, a summation you can give about The Yield?
Yes. I think I would use the term indigenous here because transcultural is too huge, as you said. I think the agenda, shall we say, of African literature, and again, we're talking about a whole continent. There's just one African literature, or indeed literature in South Asia, for example, right, or in the Caribbean. All of these are related. yes, this is where the transcultural element comes in, and you can make comparisons. You can see how things, to some extent, speak to each other, hang together. But again, they do have very specific agendas. And of course, the agenda of indigenous literature is one that is strongly tied to this experience of having become a small minority in a place that was once your livelihood. Yeah, this is what has happened to Native Americans, Native Canadians. Has happened to Maori people in New Zealand. This has happened to Aboriginal people in Australia, right? They've become small minorities. And so this experience of, being turned into minorities, and of course also being suppressed, losing their lands and so on, this gives a particular context, right, that shapes these literatures. And in the case of Australia, I mean, this thing of the stolen generations, I mean, went until the 1970s.
Mm.
It's not so far ago. It's not all 19th century, Some
Mm.
of this is actually within generational knowledge. There are many people alive who've gone through this, right? So, and in that sense, I think this is something that shapes indigenous literature. But to give now the other side, I would say, if not typical, but it shares features with other contemporary indigenous works of indigenous authors, right? In that it is indeed interested in contact zones. It is not a writing back, and it's not an in-your-face assertion. We are indigenous, we are proud, and take this, we're no longer to be oppressed. This is something which, in a sense, is part of these works as well. It is the work of previous generations who have done this labor of, sort of hoisting the Aboriginal flag or the Indigenous flag and, writing back. But there are a number of works now, whether in Australia or elsewhere, that actually try to explore, for example, these transcultural linkages between Indigenous people, non-Indigenous people. The fact to what extent Indigenous, non-Indigenous people share history, often in a very violent way, but yet still it means they share history. So we cannot talk about, Australians and Aboriginal as if these were two worlds.
Mm.
They were made to be two worlds, of course, by an Australian settler regime that tried to simply pretend that Aboriginal people didn't exist, like the famous Terra Nullius doctrine, that said nobody there. We can just, it's up for
Mm.
grabs, the land, right? Although everybody knew that there were people there, but that was the doctrine, right? So these things, there is a sort of need to overcome this, right? But, and one way of doing this is looking at early contact zones. And we can see that here in the yield, which goes back to the 19th century, right, and tells us that, yes, people have been in relation in very dramatic, very unfair ways, yes, but it is a history that goes back centuries. And there are works by other Aboriginal writers, for example, who do exactly that, who look at early contact scenarios, right? In the early 19th century, how did Aboriginal and white people, and when we say white, of course, we've got British people, we've got Irish, we've got, all sorts of, some of these white people were brought there as convicts, right? So that also is a complex history. And yet, how did these relations develop? And this idea of an absolute, shall we say, supremacist feeling of this is ours, and average people don't exist. This is something that has not always been there. I mean, the roots of this may have go back a long way, but it is something that, in the case of Australia, came up very strongly in the second half of the 19th century. And if you look before that, you find intriguing and amazing ways of indeed transcultural contact, mutual acknowledgements, the willingness to learn.
Mm.
And one of the books that I can think of, that sort of does that work very well is Kim Scott's novel, and another Aboriginal Australian writer, That Dead Man Dance, right, which goes right back to the early 19th contact scenario and follows through the life of a number of characters, how this deteriorates into
Mm.
this white supremacist stance where Aboriginal characters don't count anymore. Yeah, they're
Mm.
not, they're just outsiders. But no, when the first white people came and settled, I mean, they needed Aboriginal people for survival.
Mm,
They didn't know the land enough. They needed their help, right? And so on. So that is one way, going back in history, looking at contact scenarios from which, again, today, perhaps we might learn something, yeah,
mm.
on both sides. And I think that is something that I see also at work here in the yield. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for those comments on, these bigger, I guess, theoretical issues and approaches to reading literature. And you mentioned another text there, so we'll finish part two here. Please do join us again for part three when we'll get more of Frank's recommendations for similar books that may also be of interest. So hope to see you there.